Outside, the roses in the vicarage garden had begun to fall, their petals caught in the low breeze like feathers from an unseen bird. And in Mary Mead, Miss Marple began a new row of stitches, not because the case was incomplete, but because it was finally fully at last over. It was just past 7 in the evening, and the long summer light still filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate shadows on the carpet. She had put aside her knitting and, with her hands resting lightly on her lap, sat thinking, not with the abstract reflection of someone pondering a riddle, but with the inward calm of someone finally finishing a long piece of embroidery, each thread tucked and anchored. Yet, even as the quiet of St. Mary Mead enfolded her, there remained a single lingering thought, a fine stitch not yet tied off. Miss Marple, who had never believed in tidy endings unless they were honest, felt it distinctly. The truth had come into view at last, the poison, the plotting, the subtle hand behind both guilt and misdirection. Hester Kane, Eleanor by birth and circumstance, had fashioned herself into an instrument of justice, or perhaps vengeance on behalf of her employer. But the deeper Miss Marple looked, the more it seemed Hester's loyalty had not been directed at Lavinia Toller alone. The letter that had arrived from Inspector Graves had confirmed Hester's involvement. She had orchestrated the sequence that brought Penrose's intentions to light and Clara Ridgway's ambitions to ruin. But there was a coldness to her confession, a precision that felt calculated, practiced, not in the act of protection, but in performance. Miss Marple had seen women like that before, those whose kindness had become sharp through neglect, whose sense of morality had been twisted into something too brittle to bend. And so it surprised no one, least of all Miss Marple, when another envelope arrived by post the following morning, forwarded from the magistrate's office. It contained a statement, a letter written by Hester herself submitted after her confession, not for the court, but for Miss Marple personally. The handwriting was the same schoolgirl script from the forged envelope, carefully formed but too controlled to be natural. You saw more than I meant for you to. I'm not ashamed of what I did. I was the only one who could see clearly. Penrose believed he was clever. Clara thought her inheritance was an entitlement. But I understood what none of them did, that people like Lavinia need protection. They don't survive scandal, they fade. That would have been the real death, not Jefferson's. You will, I think, understand this. In a way the others won't, because you see how people unravel. I've seen it too. I watched Caroline Penrose fade from her own life. I saw what guilt and disappointment did to George Toller in his last year. I saw Lavinia begin to doubt her place in her own home. And I decided that if justice wasn't going to be done, I would do it myself. You were the only one I feared might put it all together. I didn't mind being caught, but I wanted you to know why. There was no signature, only the letter, folded cleanly, sealed with a neat crease, and left unadorned. Miss Marple read it once, then again, and then folded it away into her notebook without a word. Not because she lacked sympathy, but because she understood precisely what Hester had done, and what she had become in doing it. That afternoon she walked into the garden where the warm breeze stirred the lavender and geraniums. She checked the leaves for signs of mildew and instructed young Emily from the village, who had taken to helping her since school had let out, to water the hydrangeas more carefully at the roots. But her thoughts were elsewhere on the true nature of Hester Kane's crime. It was not simply murder or deception, though those were certainly present. It was something subtler, the shaping of narrative, the manipulation of guilt, the insertion of small guiding hands where chaos might otherwise have fallen. Hester had not merely protected Lavinia, she had made her into a character in a tragedy of her own design, then ensured the curtain fell precisely when she wished. And yet, even as she acknowledged this, Miss Marple felt a curious compassion for the woman. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. Hester's crime was born from a deep understanding of weakness, of the soft underbellies of pride and the fear of irrelevance. She had seen Lavinia not as a woman, but as a relic worth preserving, and had acted accordingly, even at the cost of her own freedom. The papers in the days that followed ran the story in fragmented headlines. Vicar cleared of conspiracy. Legal clerk implicated in land fraud. Foxglove poisoning suspect remanded for psychological evaluation. Village maid linked to former pharmacy scandal. They made no mention of Miss Marple, though Daphne wrote to her privately, claiming at least 3 people at the grocer's had declared her a genius, and another had said she must be a secret agent for Scotland Yard. Miss Marple wrote back thanking her niece, and suggested the vicar might appreciate a new kneeler for the communion rail, as the old one had begun to fray. But there was one final visitor before the matter was done. It was Lavinia Toller herself. She arrived quietly, wearing the same lilac coat she had worn the day of the garden exhibition, though it now hung a little looser on her shoulders. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple received her without ceremony, and made a pot of tea. They sat in the drawing-room in silence for several minutes before Lavinia spoke. He didn't know what Hester had done, not until after. Her voice was brittle, but calm. "I thought I was guilty, and in a way I was." "You were frightened," Miss Marple said gently. "That's not the same." "I was frightened," Lavinia agreed, "and I thought I could keep it all under control, delay Jefferson, appeal to reason. But the moment he died, I felt as if I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped." Miss Marple did not contradict her. She knew how guilt could shape memory. "He didn't ask her to do it," Lavinia said. "But I think I relied on her too much. Hester always knew what I needed before I asked. That's dangerous, isn't it?" "It can be," said Miss Marple. "When someone lives through another, it can blur the edges of what is kind and what is cruel." They sat for a long while, watching the sun drift down the walls. When Lavinia finally stood to leave, she hesitated at the door. "She wrote to you, didn't she?" Miss Marple nodded. "Was there any regret?" "No," she said softly, "but there was honesty. In the end, I think that was the only apology she believed you needed." Lavinia nodded once. Then she turned and walked down the garden path, her figure small and upright, until it vanished around the rose bushes. Miss Marple returned inside, drew the curtains, and lit a lamp. Her hands moved to her knitting once more, and she began a new piece, soft wool in a pale blue hue. She did not yet know what it would become, but that hardly mattered. Patterns revealed themselves in time, and in her heart she knew the last stitch of the mystery had been drawn tight. Not because justice had been served in the grand, thunderous sense, but because the truth layered, uncomfortable, utterly human, had been allowed to breathe. And that, in Miss Marple's quiet experience, was all that could be hoped for in the end. The pale blue wool slipped quietly through Miss Marple's fingers as the summer deepened around St. Mary Mead. The roses in her back garden had begun to fade, their first flush past, their second not yet ready to bloom, and the rhythm of village life resumed its usual, unhurried course. But in the thoughtful stillness of her parlor, where the ticking of the clock was the loudest sound, she remained attentive to the faintest echoes of the recent affair. The full consequences of what had transpired in Little Wickford had begun to ripple out beyond the boundaries of that tidy village. Inspector Graves wrote again, his tone more personal this time, his professional reserve soft. "It troubles me," he had confessed in the letter, "that Hester Kane might have gone unnoticed if not for you, that her manipulation was so exact, it nearly passed for natural justice. I've been thinking more than I should about the nature of guilt, how much of it rests with action and how much with omission. You make me wonder if we too often look only at what people do and not at what they allow." Miss Marple had nodded slightly as she read, though no one could see her. She knew that precise worry, the subtle dangers of moral passivity. People who stood by, watched, and said nothing. Those were sometimes the ones who left the deepest wounds behind. She had intended to set the matter down, to return to her quiet routines, but one final piece returned to her, not a new development, but something she'd overlooked in the thick of the investigation. A memory from that first afternoon at the Garden Conservancy tea, when the model village had stood proudly in the marquee, and Felix Jefferson had arrived just before the collapse of events. There had been a curious exchange, a passing remark overheard, barely noticed at the time, but now it stood out. Colonel Marchbank had said, "He doesn't usually grace our little fancies. Must be business if it's pulled him away from the cricket pitch." At the time, the colonel's words had been taken as typical bluster, but Jefferson had never mentioned his visit in any formal appointment book. He had not told his clerk. He had not, according to Lavinia, given notice. If not summoned by her, and not by the Reverend Partridge, and not even formally invited by the Conservancy Committee, then the answer, Miss Marple now realized, might explain the one element that had never fully settled why Jefferson had been alone in the rectory library, unaccompanied, away from the garden, away from the tea, away from the very people he had ostensibly come to speak with. She consulted her notebook again, flipping to the page where she had jotted down the order of events. The library had been empty before Jefferson entered it. He had gone there directly, bypassing the guests and the marquis. He had already been expected, and someone had seen him arrive. Miss Marple penned a short note to Inspector Graves, requesting the event's full guest list, not just the formal invites but the additions scribbled in at the door by the churchwarden who'd managed to check in. It was the sort of record easily overlooked, but always kept. Within 3 days it arrived, scrawled and slightly rain-streaked. She reviewed the names carefully. Most were familiar, but one at the bottom, written in different handwriting, stood out. Beatrice Worsley. Miss Marple's knitting dropped momentarily to her lap. Beatrice Worsley had once been Beatrice Kane. She had been Hester's older sister. She had married a local man nearly a decade earlier and moved away to Guildford. Her name hadn't come up during the investigation because she hadn't been part of Hester's known employment history, and the Worsley name hadn't registered with anyone, least of all Miss Marple herself. But now the pieces clicked. It was Beatrice who had invited Jefferson, not under her own name, but as a member of the Conservancy Committee. She had returned quietly to Little Wickford just days before the tea, claiming to assist with the arrangements. A perfectly plausible pretext. She had no history with the solicitor, but she had known her sister's employer. And more importantly, she had known her sister's intention. It was Beatrice who had brought Jefferson to the library. It was Beatrice who had fetched the glass. It was Beatrice who had returned, unnoticed, to the garden while Jefferson sipped the poisoned sherry in a quiet room. Hester had not acted alone. She had a partner, someone close enough to trust, distant enough to escape suspicion. Miss Marple sat very still. There was no evidence of Beatrice's direct involvement in the death. No fingerprint, no note, no confession. But there was motive. There was opportunity, and there was the same careful logic Hester had exhibited. The neatness, the staged conclusion, the precise placement of guilt. And then Miss Marple recalled something else. Hester's phrase, "She doesn't survive scandal, she fades." Note wouldn't survive. Does. Past tense. Spoken with certainty. She had not been referring to Lavinia alone. She had seen it before. Caroline Penrose. What if it had not been Charles Penrose at all who dosed Caroline's medicine? What if Hester or Beatrice had done it instead? Caroline, who had once contested the will and threatened the fragile balance Lavinia had maintained in her widowhood. Caroline, who had returned briefly to visit Lavinia the year before her death, an unannounced visit, noted only once by the local pharmacist who'd sold her a mild sedative. Miss Marple reached for her pen and paper again. This time, not to contact Graves, but to draft a longer letter to someone at the Home Office. Not for accusation but for clarity. She asked only that the coroner's file for Caroline Penrose be reopened, and that the handwriting on the letter submitted by Charles Penrose be matched against the known samples of his writing and that of Beatrice Worsley, if available. She signed it, folded it neatly, and sealed it with her usual wax. And then, once more she returned to her knitting. The wool moved more slowly this time, not because she was uncertain, but because she knew that the final row of any mystery was the one most often unraveled. Hester had believed she was orchestrating justice, but what she had truly created was a story so convincing it had blinded even herself to the deeper truth, that her version of right and wrong had not come from morality, but from fear. And fear, Miss Marple knew better than most, was rarely content to stay confined to a single crime. It had ripples, and sometimes the deadliest hands were not the ones that held the poison, but the ones that pointed where others should look. She tied off her thread. The pattern was nearly finished, but the last stitch, as always, would require care. The letter was posted on a Thursday, when the air in St. Mary Mead was filled with the scent of ripening pears and the subtle rustle of hedgerow leaves shifting in a soft wind. Miss Marple had walked to the post office herself, slipping the envelope into the red box with the familiar finality of someone placing the last piece in a carefully assembled puzzle. There was no sense of triumph in the act, only quiet resolution. This was no longer about blame, it was about balance, setting things straight where they had been subtly bent. The Home Office did not respond immediately, nor had Miss Marple expected them to. Things of this nature, she knew, moved at a pace governed less by urgency than by bureaucracy's slow churn. She returned to her ordinary days, which were not so ordinary to those who knew how keenly she observed the world around her. The postmistress began asking fewer questions. The village children resumed their summer mischief, and even the vicar seemed to sigh with relief when, one Sunday, Miss Marple failed to mention any improvement suggestions for the church flower rot. It was nearly 2 weeks later, just as the weather turned and rain returned to the countryside, that the envelope came. Cream-colored, official, and stamped with the discreet seal of the Forensic Records and Review Division. Miss Marple opened it at her writing desk with care. The letter inside was brief, formal. Further to your inquiry regarding the handwriting and signature discrepancies on the envelope addressed to the late Felix Jefferson, we confirm that the handwriting is not that of Caroline Penrose, nor of her husband Charles Penrose. A match has been positively identified with known writing samples of Beatrice Worsley, formerly Beatrice Kane. In light of these findings, a supplemental investigation has been reopened in coordination with local law enforcement. We are grateful for your observations and discretion. There it was, then. Miss Marple set the letter down and stared out the window for a long moment, her hands still. Outside, the rain streaked faintly down the glass, and the garden, so bright only days before, now sat damp and subdued, its colors blurred into gray-green impressions. She felt no satisfaction, only the slow settling of certainty. Beatrice had done it. Not only had she written the letter and guided Jefferson into the fatal setting, she had likely played a hand in the quiet death of Caroline Penrose the year before. It was not just loyalty to her sister that had driven her. It was the belief that she, like Hester, knew better, that she could protect from the shadows and manage consequences. But in doing so, she had become something far colder than protector. She had become architect and executioner. And like all architects of deception, Beatrice had relied not on boldness, but on distance. She had not needed to touch the poison, only to place the cup where the hand would reach it. She had not needed to silence Caroline merely to delay the doctor's visit, perhaps replace one medicine bottle with another. Subtle, efficient, and seemingly invisible. Miss Marple had seen such people before. Not villains as the world understood them, but people who could justify almost anything under the banner of caretaking. She had once remarked to her nephew Raymond that the most dangerous individuals were often those who believed their actions were purely benevolent, not the greedy or the cruel, but those with a vision of order and the will to enforce it quietly. She made another pot of tea, strong and dark, and took it to the sitting room, where the wireless murmured in low tones. It was nearly noon when the knock came. Beatrice Worsley stood in the doorway. Her hat was perfectly straight, her coat too warm for the weather, and her expression utterly composed. "I had a feeling I'd find you in," she said, without warmth. "May I come in?" Miss Marple stepped aside, saying nothing. They sat facing each other by the fire, though the day was not cold enough for flames. Beatrice did not touch the tea. Miss Marple poured. "You know," Beatrice said at last, her voice crisp, "I told myself it would go unnoticed, that I'd handled it cleanly, but I suppose I always wondered if someone might see the joins." "It was very nearly seamless," Miss Marple replied gently, "but seams always show if you know where to look." Beatrice's lips tightened. "I didn't want Caroline to suffer. I didn't even hate her. But she was going to destroy Lavinia. She had letters, records. She wanted to make it public to humiliate her. All over a will written 15 years before. I tried to dissuade her, and when she wouldn't be dissuaded, you acted. He helped her rest, that's all." She glanced at Miss Marple. "Don't look at me like that. You know what Lavinia's pride was like. You said it yourself, some women fade under scandal. Caroline would have killed her slowly. I only chose the quicker path." Miss Marple stirred her tea, her movements precise. "You believed Lavinia too fragile for the truth, but she's still here. Survived it all." Beatrice looked away. "She doesn't know. She never will." "You mean about Caroline? Perhaps not, but the truth of Jefferson's death will come to her in time, and that will be enough." There was a long pause. "She doesn't have to know about me," Beatrice said quietly. "Not really. I don't care what the authorities decide. But Lavinia, she's been through enough." Miss Marple studied her carefully. There was no remorse in Beatrice's voice, only "You will not make promises," Miss Marple said at last. "But I will say this, secrets protected too long begin to rot. Lavinia is stronger than you think, and the truth, however painful, is the only ground on which anything real can be rebuilt." Beatrice stood abruptly. "That's poetic, but unnecessary." She paused at the door, her hand on the knob. He only ever tried to keep the world from collapsing around her. Miss Marple rose too, and even so, "Beatrice, you helped it collapse around everyone else." Beatrice didn't look back. She stepped out into the drizzle and disappeared into the pale light. Her figure soon lost to the hedgerows. Miss Marple watched her go, then returned to her chair. She picked up her knitting again, her soft blue wool half formed into a shawl. Her hands moved slowly, and with each stitch she felt something unknit itself from her shoulders. The truth, after all, was not always a thunderclap. Sometimes it was a faint thread drawn patiently from a tapestry that had seemed whole. One line of dust, one word in the wrong handwriting, one woman standing too far from the garden party. And in the quiet that followed, she did not feel triumphant. Only the dust had spelled a name, but it had not revealed the hand that placed it, until now. It was nearly a week before the final word came. Inspector Graves telephoned on a Thursday morning, his voice low and weary, the kind of voice that had seen the truth not as revelation but burden. Miss Marple, sitting with a small slice of Dundee cake and her morning correspondence, listened without interruption. "Yes," he said, "we've confirmed it all." The Home Office reviewed Caroline Penrose's medical history. Her bottle of tincture digitalis again had been tampered with, a dosage well beyond therapeutic levels. The local doctor thought it was heart failure. There was no autopsy. "And Beatrice?" Miss Marple asked, though she already knew. "She confessed in full," Graves replied, "not out of remorse, just precision. No wavering, no justifications. She called it a necessity of symmetry. Said Caroline's death was the only way to keep things aligned." Miss Marple was quiet. "There's no doubt Hester knew," Graves added. "Whether she helped directly or simply obeyed, we can't say, but she followed her sister's lead. Every move, Jefferson, the letter, Clara, it was part of a pattern." "I suppose," Miss Marple murmured, "when people imagine themselves as guardians, they eventually forget whom they're guarding against." "She'll be tried," he said. "There'll be no public scandal. They'll manage it quietly. Lavinia has already been informed of Jefferson's case being formally closed. She doesn't know the rest. Perhaps she needn't, Miss Marple said gently. She's been through her share. They said their farewells. Graves thanked her again, but with a humility that went deeper this time. Miss Marple set down the receiver and turned back to the window. The garden was beginning its slow shift into late summer, when the brightness dulled into bronze, and everything seemed to pause just before fading. She watched a bee drift through the lavender, then vanish. There was peace in it. Lavinia Toller wrote a letter 2 days later, a careful, sloping hand. "You were right," she wrote. "I am still here. I thought I would break, and I haven't. The scandal passed, and the house is quiet again. But it isn't silence I fear anymore. It's not knowing. I don't need the whole truth, Jane, but I needed to know I wasn't mad to think the world had tilted strangely. I know you made sure the right things were seen. Thank you." It was signed simply, L. Miss Marple read it twice and placed it in her wooden box, among the other letters she never showed anyone. That Sunday she went to church and took her usual pew, nodding to the vicar, who had regained his mild rhythm of speech. No one in the village spoke of the murder anymore. It had been swallowed into the place's long memory, filed away under that unfortunate business, which was how little Wickford had already begun to refer to it. But Miss Marple remembered every detail, not because it was sensational, not because it was dark, but because it was human. Felix Jefferson had died because of fear that Lavinia would lose her place. Caroline Penrose had died because of pride, her unwillingness to let go of an old grievance. Clara Ridgway had tried to exploit what she thought was an opening and found herself ensnared in a trap far beyond her depth. And Beatrice Kane, quiet, efficient, entirely overlooked, had pulled every string with the belief that her control could keep chaos at bay. But life, Miss Marple thought as she strolled through her garden that afternoon, is not a model village. It cannot be arranged with tiny fences and painted doors. It resists containment. People spill out of the boundaries we build for them. Dust had spelled a name, and everyone had looked at that name and believed it was the answer. Only one person had thought to ask who placed it there. In that question everything turned. She bent to prune a withering bloom, her secateurs slicing through the dry stem with a crisp snap. The petals fell silently. In her heart a story was finished. Not because everyone had paid the price, but because everyone had at last been seen. Ein verlassener Schreibtisch und Staub, der mehr verriet als Worte. Willkommen bei Dunkle Senke, ich bin euer Gastgeber Thronwick. Schreibt mir in die Kommentare, wo ihr heute zuhört. Ich bin gespannt. Eure Nachrichten machen das Ganze lebendig, danke dafür. The sun filtered lazily through the lime trees that lined the high street of Little Wickford, a village so immaculately trimmed and politely mannered that even the sparrows chirped as if they'd attended finishing school. It was the 3rd Thursday of June, a date circled in many a diary, for it was the annual Garden Conservancy Society tea and exhibition, held this year on the sloping lawns of the Reverend Partridge's rectory. Tables creaked beneath the weight of Victoria sponges, iced lemon drizzles, and scones so light they seemed to levitate. Elderly ladies in pastel twin sets cooed over hydrangea arrangements. Retired colonels attempted to outboast one another in lawn care technique, and beneath the marquee, a long table displayed the centerpiece of this year's exhibition, the Village Model Homes display, a detailed miniature of Little Wickford handcrafted by Mrs. Lavinia Toller over the course of 18 painstaking months. "She's even included the pigeons on the town hall roof," whispered Miss Hartle, a bony woman with a fondness for rumor. "Of course, she has nothing else to do now, poor thing." Mrs. Toller, widowed these 4 years, stood by her masterpiece with a proprietorial air. Her eyes missed nothing. Among the mingling guests was Miss Jane Marple, visiting from St. Mary Mead and staying a fortnight with her nephew's wife, young Daphne Marple Hewitt. Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly and observed people's mannerisms, their glances, their silences. It was almost agreeable. Until the scream. It came from the rectory library. The noise of china and conversation shattered as several guests rushed inside. Miss Marple remained seated a moment longer, lips pursed before setting her cup down and rising. Inside, a small knot of guests had gathered, gaping in horror. Slumped across the worn oak writing desk was Mr. Felix Jefferson, a solicitor from nearby Market Ledbury. His head lay at an odd angle, and the ink pot beside him had toppled, staining the blotter, and his sleeve a deep midnight blue. The Reverend Partridge, red-faced and sweating, clutched a lace doily like a talisman. Someone fetched the police. "My word, he's dead." "You should say so," murmured Colonel Marchbank, peering down with the dispassion of someone inspecting a misplaced rake. "No visible wound. Stroke, perhaps." "No," said a crisp, unexpected voice. Miss Marple had stepped closer. "If you please, Reverend, do not touch anything." No, of course not," Partridge stammered. The room was quiet save for the murmurs from outside. Then Mrs. Toller entered, flustered, still wearing her gardening gloves. "What on earth, oh dear God." Everyone turned to stare, for on the desk, in a patch of disturbed dust near the body, was a single word, smeared by fingers that trembled in their last moments. "Lavinia." Miss Marple, eyes narrowed just a touch, watched the color drain from Mrs. Toller's face. No one noticed her murmur, almost inaudible amid the shocked gasps. People very often say what they mean to hide, just a little too late. The air in the rectory library had curdled into a tension as thick as the clotted cream on the scones outside. The cheerful hum of the Garden Conservancy Society's festivities had withered into murmurs of confusion and dread. Someone had laid a crochet throw over Mr. Jefferson's body, though it did little to restore dignity to a scene already haunted by the macabre clarity of that single word smudged in the dust. "Lavinia." Mrs. Toller had been seated on a straight-backed chair in the drawing-room, a cup of brandy trembling in her hand. Miss Marple sat nearby, her knitting bag on her lap, though the needles remained untouched. "I don't know why he would write my name," Mrs. Toller said hoarsely, her fingers twitching against the porcelain. It must be a mistake, a coincidence. Surely. There are other Lavinias in the world." "Not many in Little Wickford," murmured Miss Marple gently, her voice as soft and undemanding as a moth's wing. "Though I dare say one mustn't leap to conclusion." Detective Inspector Colin Graves arrived from Market Ledbury just before 4 o'clock, a capable man with a neat mustache and an impatient air. He took the measure of the room with a practiced eye before being ushered into the library. "There was no sign of struggle," he said, having inspected the body, "but I'll wager he was poisoned. Cardiac arrest doesn't usually result in such suggestive messages." He said this with a glance toward the smear in the dust, which had now been photographed and carefully preserved by a junior constable. Miss Marple did not offer her opinion unbidden. She sat by the open window in the drawing-room, listening to the sounds of guests dispersing and car engines grumbling reluctantly down the drive. The village would be humming with gossip within the hour. Daphne Marple appeared in the doorway, breathless. "Aunt Jane, they say someone saw Mr. Jefferson arguing with Lavinia Toller just last week, outside the post office. Something about papers and a promise broken." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "He was her late husband's solicitor, wasn't he?" "Yes," said Daphne. "He handled George Toller's will, left her everything, apparently, which some of the family found rather difficult." "People do become so territorial about the dead," Miss Marple remarked, not unkindly. "And wills are rather like magnifying glasses, aren't they? They make all the small grievances much larger." Inspector Graves reappeared, stepping into the drawing-room with a notepad. "Mrs. Toller," he said briskly, "I understand Mr. Jefferson was your solicitor. Would you care to explain what business brought him to the rectory today?" She stiffened. "I had no idea he was coming. I assumed he was here like everyone else for the exhibition." I haven't spoken to him properly in weeks. Mrs. Toller, said the inspector, tapping his pen lightly, do you deny the two of you had an argument in public on the 12th of this month? She paused. It was hardly an argument. He'd promised to provide copies of some papers, George's investment records. He was being rather slow and I was insistent. Miss Marple's eyes twitched toward her knitting bag, where the needles still lay dormant. It was unlike her to leave them untouched for so long. The next morning the news was inescapable. A handwritten note tacked to the village shop's notice board announced, in trembling penmanship, the postponement of all garden conservancy events. Miss Carter from the bakery claimed she'd sold Jefferson a cherry scone the day before, and that he'd seemed distracted, as if he knew something was about to catch up with him. At the vicarage, the Reverend Partridge wandered like a man spiritually concussed. In my own library, he muttered to anyone who would listen, on God's own furniture. Miss Marple took a walk through the village shortly after Elevensis, nodding politely to familiar faces and observing the subtle ripples the crime had caused. Mrs. Toller had not left her cottage. Her maid, young Hester Kane, had been seen hurrying toward the grocer's, with her apron still dusted with flour. Miss Marple stopped her gently. You're quite brave, my dear, helping your mistress in such circumstances. She's not herself, Hester said. Won't eat. Keeps muttering about how dust doesn't lie. That, Miss Marple thought, was rather an interesting turn of phrase. By lunchtime, Inspector Graves had begun interviewing the residents more thoroughly. It came to light that Mr. Jefferson had also recently taken a strong interest in the church's land records, particularly a parcel bordering the Toller property, now uncultivated and overgrown. There's talk of a new railway spur, said Colonel Marchbank, who'd managed to insert himself into the matter with the ease of a man born to interfere. Jefferson knew something, mark my words. That land would triple in value overnight. Miss Marple did not dismiss the theory. Greed could be a potent motivator, but she also recalled a different kind of greed, emotional, vengeful, the kind born not of money but of pride. That afternoon, while the village speculated and theories blossomed like midsummer weeds, Miss Marple paid a quiet call to the rectory. The Reverend was in his study, red-eyed and still shaken, but he greeted her with a smile that reached for composure. You wondered, Miss Marple said gently, if I might see the desk again. The study remained sealed. Inspector Graves, after some hesitation, allowed her entry under supervision. She moved slowly, thoughtfully, examining the desk surface and the surrounding items. She made no dramatic gestures, nor did she touch anything. But she noted two things. First, a faint ring in the dust beside the blotter, possibly from a cup or glass not present now. Second, the smear of dust spelling Illavenia had been made in a single motion, swift, shaky, dying. Would you mind very much, she asked Graves softly, if we found out whether the Reverend's housekeeper noticed any missing cups? Or perhaps glasses? He gave her a look, a mixture of resignation and curiosity, and summoned the housekeeper, a practical woman named Mrs. Danvers who remembered everything and liked to be asked. There were 4 sherry glasses yesterday morning, set out for the tea, she said. Only 3 returned from the library. I thought nothing of it, perhaps one was left behind the desk, but no glass was ever found. By evening, the theory of poison had gained ground. The coroner's preliminary examination revealed signs of digitalis, a toxic substance often used in heart medication, but deadly in the wrong dose. Foxglove, Miss Marple murmured, glancing at the abundant clusters in the Toller garden visible from her guest bedroom window. How terribly convenient that so many plants can kill. She said nothing more, but as she sat down with Daphne for supper, she made a curious request. Could you, dear, ask your husband to find out whether Mr. Jefferson was scheduled to deliver any legal documents this week? Something formal, something important. Daphne blinked.
You suppose?
He mentioned something about updating the church's charity registry. Yes, I remember now. Reverend Partridge said the papers were overdue. Miss Marple nodded, pleased but grave. The dust, the missing glass, the hidden motive, They were all threads in a complex, tightly stitched pattern. But as with all knitting, one must sometimes unravel a little to understand how the whole came together. Later that night, as the village turned in and the last of the day's light faded, Miss Marple sat by the window, her needles finally in motion. Her gaze drifted toward the quiet silhouette of Lavinia Toller's cottage, where no lights had come on. "People do say such interesting things," she murmured aloud, "especially when they don't know how much they've already revealed." The village slept uneasily that night, unaware that the next day would bring a discovery that would shift the weight of suspicion once again and push Miss Marple closer to the truth, nestled beneath the dust and decency of Little Wickford. The following morning broke with a pale mist curling over the rooftops of Little Wickford, softening the lines of the cottages and lending the village a hush more suited to reflection than gossip. But reflection was not what stirred in the hearts of its residents. Already, shutters twitched and boots clicked briskly on cobblestones as villagers made quiet pilgrimages to the post office or the bakery, not for letters or loaves, but to listen, to speculate. At Toller cottage, the windows remained firmly shuttered. No movement, not even from the lace curtain in the parlor that usually shifted with the rhythm of Mrs. Toller's daily routine. A few neighbors lingered nearby, pretending to examine a nearby rosebush or fuss over a tricycle, hoping for a glimpse or a whisper. They got neither. Miss Marple, having already walked to the rectory under the pretext of returning a borrowed book, sat once more in the study with Inspector Graves. The air between them was one of mutual, cautious regard. "Digitalis confirmed," Graves said, setting a teacup on the desk. "This one quite real, not imagined in a smear of dust. Coroner's report just came through, in Gestett within the hour before death. No obvious delivery method, no food, no tea. But we've searched this room high and low, and there's still no sign of a missing sherry glass." "And yet Mrs. Danvers was certain," Miss Marple replied gently, as if reluctant to press the point. "I do believe her. Some people, housekeepers, gardeners, spinsters, tend to notice the tiniest details because no one expects them to." Graves smiled faintly, and some spinsters notice rather a lot more than they let on. Miss Marple looked quite pleased at that. He continued, "I've spoken to Jefferson's clerk in Market Ledbury. The solicitor was indeed preparing a document for the Reverend, something to do with a land trust connected to the church, oddly enough. And here's the rub. It involved correcting an error in an old deed from nearly 40 years ago, a transfer that was improperly registered, affecting not just church land, but a portion of what is now the Toller estate." "You see," said Miss Marple softly, folding her hands in her lap. "Do you?" asked Graves, almost amused. "Because I barely do. The legal language thick enough to choke a vicar." "It isn't the language, Inspector. It's the implications. Suppose Mr. Jefferson intended to reveal that part of the land Lavinia Toller thought was hers never legally was. Suppose he intended to correct that oversight, even in late life. Meaning she'd stand to lose it." "Meaning," said Miss Marple, "that she might lose everything her husband left her. Her pride, her security, her sense of place in the village. People can bear hardship, Inspector, but not humiliation, especially not quiet people who have nothing else left to stand on." Graves grew thoughtful. "Still, we've no proof she knew what was coming. He could have been planning to discuss it with her after the exhibition. She claims she didn't even know he'd be there." "Did she?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "And yet he was found in the library, of all places where one might expect a man to go if summoned discreetly to speak, in confidence. Not part of the crowd, not near the model village or the tea tables." Graves tapped the pen against his chin. "You think she arranged to meet him privately? At her own risk? To what end?" But before Miss Marple could reply, a knock came at the study door. It was the constable, face pinched with that uncertain mix of nerves and duty. "There's something you ought to see, sir, over at the Toller place." They crossed the lane in silence, with Miss Marple following at her own pace. The front door of the cottage had been opened by Hester, who stood aside as they entered. Her eyes were wide but not afraid, resolute. "In the porting shed," she said simply, "behind the ivy rake. I didn't notice it before, not until I went out this morning for twine." Inside the shed, the smell of earth and old tools was thick and honest, and just behind the rack, concealed hastily among cracked pots, was a single sherry glass, clean, but not perfectly so. Faint traces of a sticky residue clung to the inside, and a petal from a crushed foxglove leaf was caught in the base. Graves held it up in his gloved hand. "That's our vessel." Miss Marple stood at his threshold, gaze steady. She must have prepared it in advance, perhaps even carried it in her handbag. She could have offered it to him as refreshment, under the guise of hospitality. After all, it was a warm day. People get thirsty. Hester shifted slightly but didn't speak. Miss Marple turned to her. Did she seem different that morning? Yes, Hester admitted. Restless. She took a long walk early, then came back and rearranged the sitting room twice over. Then she went upstairs and stayed in her bedroom for a long while. When she came down, she was dressed in her old lilac coat, the one she only wears when she wants to look soft. The girl flushed, as if revealing a betrayal. "Thank you, dear," Miss Marple said gently. "That tells us quite a lot." Back in the cottage parlor, Mrs. Toller sat by the fireplace, though no fire was lit. Her hands lay neatly folded in her lap, and a handkerchief embroidered with forget-me-nots peeked from her cuff. She looked up as they entered, her eyes tired, resigned. "Graves was brisk. Be found the glass, Mrs. Toller. The one you gave Mr. Jefferson." "You see." Her voice was calm. "You'll find the foxgloves missing from the back border too. I used just enough to be sure. I read about it in a gardening almanac. Digitalis. It seemed rather elegant." Hester gasped softly. "Madame." "Hush, child." Lavinia's eyes did not leave Graves's. "I never meant for it to go so far. I only wanted to frighten him, to stop him from delivering the papers. I thought if he fell ill, he might delay, and I'd have time to fix things." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice low but steady. "You didn't expect he'd write anything, least of all your name?" "No," Lavinia said faintly. "It didn't occur to me that he'd know, but perhaps he did. Or perhaps he just assumed. People do." There was a pause. "He did," said Miss Marple quietly. "You are the last familiar face he saw." Graves straightened. "You understand this will have to go to the magistrate." Lavinia rose, smoothing her skirt. "Yes, of course. I'll pack a bag. It's all quite over, I suppose." Miss Marple watched her go with something like sorrow in her eyes. As the inspector gave directions and the constable stepped outside to radio, Miss Marple turned to Hester and laid a comforting hand on the girl's arm. "She didn't intend death. But intentions don't wash away outcomes, do they?" Hester whispered. "She loved this house more than anything. I think she couldn't bear to lose the last thing she had from Mr. Toller." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the hearth. "So many murders come from love in the end. Love that turns into fear or pride or fury, but love all the same." Outside, the mist had lifted. The air had that stillness which always followed a confession. In Little Wickford, gossip would swell again, and life would reassemble itself crookedly, as life often did. But Miss Marple, walking home past the foxglove beds and the model village table, now gathering dust under a canvas sheet, felt the quiet weight of understanding settle around her like an old shawl. Another pattern revealed. Another heart laid bare. The arrest of Lavinia Toller cast a long and curious shadow across Little Wickford. It was not the sort of dramatic scandal the villagers had expected. There was no wailing or resistance, no last-minute flight or declaration of innocence, just a solemn nod and a quiet departure in the back of Inspector Graves's motor car, as though she were heading to a committee meeting rather than the magistrate's bench. And that, in itself, unsettled the village more than any dramatics could have. By the following morning the news had matured like overripe fruit. Some were convinced she was guilty beyond all doubt. Others whispered that it had all been a terrible mistake, that she had only meant to frighten Felix Jefferson, not kill him. But no one could quite make sense of the thing that lingered. Why would a woman as precise and calculating as Lavinia Toller leave her own name smeared in dust beside the body? Was it a cry of guilt, a twisted confession, or something else entirely? Miss Marple was not satisfied. She sat at the breakfast table with Daphne Marple Hewitt, whose expression bore the particular blend of concern and polite fascination that characterized women of her set when real-life events mirrored the novels they privately devoured. "I must admit," Daphne said as she stirred her tea, "it doesn't sit right with me. Lavinia was proud, yes, but poisoning? It seems a rather grubby business for her." Miss Marple looked over the rim of her teacup. "Indeed, poison is a curious method, so intimate, so deliberate. It requires a peculiar kind of resolve." She confessed, didn't she? She confessed to preparing the glass, but not, you'll notice, to putting it in his hands, and she was very careful to say she only meant to make him ill. Daphne frowned. "But isn't that splitting hairs?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said mildly, "but hairs do matter, dear. Especially when they're found at crime scenes." With the village abbess and Lavinia in custody, Graves had relaxed somewhat, though his instincts were not entirely at rest. He invited Miss Marple to tea that afternoon at the Crown and Antler, where they might compare notes under the neutral cover of scones and a pot of Darjeeling. "She's not the only one with motive," he said, passing her the sugar bowl. "There's George Toller's niece, Clara Ridgway. Her mother contested the will years ago, and when she lost, Clara left the village. But she came back last month, quiet as a mouse, took a room at the Swan, and told everyone she was writing a memoir." Miss Marple took a moment to add a slice of lemon to her tea. "Ah, yes. I noticed her at the exhibition lingering near the model of the Toller house. Odd expression, rather like someone looking at something they once owned and now aren't allowed to touch." Graves leaned forward. "Exactly. Now here's the twist. Jefferson was seen speaking with her last week, just outside the solicitor's office. Heated exchange, according to the tobacconist next door. Was she seen at the rectory the day of the murder? She signed the guest register, arrived late, left early. No one remembers speaking to her directly, which in itself is telling." Miss Marple sipped her tea, eyes thoughtful. "You said Lavinia might not have delivered the glass to Mr. Jefferson herself. Suppose someone else did?" Graves nodded slowly. "Suppose someone knew she had prepared it, or found it ready. It wouldn't take much, just switch glasses when no one was looking. And if they believed she would be blamed," Miss Marple added, "all the better. A motive covered by another's guilt." Graves leaned back, frowning. "Do you think Clara knew about the land deed error?" "You should think she had every reason to. If Jefferson had finally agreed to reverse the error or even hinted at it, she might have seen her chance to reclaim what her family lost." Graves tapped his spoon once against the saucer. "So you believe Lavinia's guilt was convenient?" Miss Marple allowed herself a brief smile. "It often is." Later that evening, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the village hall, where a rehearsal for the summer fete was underway. Children's voices floated through the air, clear and carefree, as if untouched by the scandal. But the adults milling about, Miss Hertel, Colonel Marchbank, and several others, spoke in lowered tones, each carrying a pet theory like a parcel under the arm. She passed the Swan Inn, its windows glowing dimly. Clara Ridgway was seated at the corner table inside, bent over a notebook with a fountain pen poised in her hand but unmoving. Her eyes were not on the page, but fixed on the empty bar mirror where her own reflection stared back at her with unnerving stillness. The next day brought rain, soft and persistent, veiling the village in a grey hush. Miss Marple visited the post office under the excuse of collecting stamps, but lingered near the shelf until a postmistress, Mrs. Winks, offered an offhand remark that proved more revealing than intended. "Miss Ridgway's been receiving letters from London," she said, peering down the sorting tray. "Thick envelopes too, legal I'd wager. Barrister's stamp on one of them." Miss Marple nodded politely and stepped out, just as Clara Ridgway approached from the opposite end of the lane. The two women met under the awning. Clara looked startled, then polite. "Miss Marple, isn't it?" "Yes, my dear." "Awful weather, isn't it?" Clara gave a clipped smile. "It keeps the questions away. People don't lean out of windows when it rains." "You find people more likely to reveal things in the rain," Miss Marple said gently. "They feel it washes away the truth. But it doesn't." Clara's face tensed. "If you've something to say, please say it. Only that I understand how disappointment can harden into something sharp. Your family lost what it believed was rightfully theirs. That sort of thing festers, especially in a village." "He didn't poison anyone." "No, I don't believe you did." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "But I believe you may have helped ensure someone else did." There was a beat, 1 second too long. "You don't know what you mean." Miss Marple stepped aside. "Of course." "Good day, Miss Ridgway." By evening, Miss Marple had sent word to Inspector Graves. She did not offer a declaration, merely a suggestion that he request a search of Clara Ridgway's room. The letter from the London barrister, she said, would prove illuminating. By mid-morning the next day, Graves confirmed it. The letter was from Jefferson's chambers, confirming that the deed correction had been approved for filing. The reversal would restore a portion of the Toller estate to Clara Ridgway. She stood to regain nearly half of what her family had lost, but only if the current deed holder did not contest. If Lavinia Toller were implicated in murder, her ability to defend the claim would be compromised. The trust itself could be thrown into dispute, especially if Clara had begun legal proceedings first. "She didn't poison Jefferson," Graves said grimly, "but she made sure someone did, and watched while they took the fall." Miss Marple nodded. The crime was the murder, but the cruelty was in letting someone else carry it. They arrested Clara Ridgway quietly. She offered no confession, only silence. That, in its way, was admission enough. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to the guest room at Daphne's and sat by the fire, her knitting needles finally clicking again. The rain had stopped, and a hush had returned to Little Wickford, not of peace exactly, but of something restored. "Truth," she murmured, "is like dust. It doesn't disappear. It settles, until someone brushes it aside." The days that followed Clara Ridgway's quiet arrest unfurled with the odd stillness that comes in the wake of a storm, the sort that leaves no broken branches behind, only questions suspended in the air like mist on the village green. Little Wickford, now brimming with half-formed theories and fractured sympathies, returned with unnatural swiftness to its routines. Cakes were baked, lawns were trimmed, the vicar resumed his mild sermons, and the bells of St. Cuthbert's rang dutifully each morning. But a shadow remained. In the eyes of the villagers, the matter was concluded. One woman had poisoned, another had plotted. The courts would sort out the rest. But Miss Marple, whose expression had taken on a sharper stillness in the days since Clara's arrest, was not yet finished with her knitting, nor with the case. Something yet tugged at her thoughts lightly, persistently, like the dropped stitch in a scarf that refuses to hide. She thought about Lavinia, still held pending formal charges, quietly waiting in a magistrate's cell. There had been no denials, no protestations, but nor had there been satisfaction. A woman as meticulous as Lavinia Toller, so precise in her words and movements, would never have left a single smudged word as her final trace if she were innocent, or if she were guilty with intention. And then there was Felix Jefferson himself. A man not well liked, exactly, but respected. Methodical, careful, Why had he come to the rectory library at all, rather than meeting Clara Ridgway privately to finalize the deed? And what about the cup placed there so conveniently, yet never seen in his hand? Miss Marple visited Inspector Graves one final time, under the pretext of delivering a jar of Daphne's quince jelly. He was in the midst of paperwork, but set it aside as soon as he saw her. "You look as though something's occurred to you," he said, gesturing her in. "It has," she said softly, setting the jar on the corner of his desk. "There's a gap, you see. A very small one, but I do find it troubling." "Do tell." Miss Marple folded her hands. Why was Felix Jefferson in the library? Everyone assumes Lavinia summoned him, or that he went there of his own volition. But suppose someone else sent for him? Grace leaned forward. Clara? No. Clara had no authority at the rectory, no influence, but someone else might. Someone who lived there. The inspector raised his eyebrows. "You mean the Reverend?" Miss Marple gave a slight nod. He had the motive to prevent the correction of that deed. If Jefferson had gone forward with the filing, a portion of the church's land would have been returned to Clara. That very same strip that borders the Toller property, the one the Reverend's been informally cultivating for years. Graves' face darkened. "You think Partridge tampered with the legal documents?" "I think," said Miss Marple delicately, "that he had every reason to fear that Jefferson's filing would expose that the church had no rightful claim to that land at all. And losing it might have damaged his position financially and socially. It would have appeared careless, worse, dishonest. But surely he wouldn't go as far as poison? No, I don't believe he intended murder, but I believe he saw the opportunity to allow suspicion to settle where it suited him." Graves stood and began pacing. "You're suggesting the Reverend intercepted the glass?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied, "that he found the glass, prepared and set aside by Lavinia, who meant only to delay Jefferson, and that he delivered it himself, unseen. He knew the man would die quietly, unceremoniously. He may not even have realized the dose was lethal, but the message in the dust, Lavinia..." Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "Exactly. Why would Jefferson write her name and not say Reverend, unless someone told him, in his final moment, that it was Lavinia who had poisoned him? If Partridge handed him the glass and, in passing, made a remark, 'Mrs. Toller wanted you to have this,' it would seal the illusion." Graves paused at the window, then turned. "It's clever, diabolically so. It removes both obstacles in one blow. Jefferson and the troublesome clause, and Lavinia, whose presence and memory of George Toller might raise questions, but we've no proof." "No," said Miss Marple, rising. "Only instinct. But instincts can be verified. Might I suggest a small test? Have the rectory library dusted thoroughly, not just for prints, but for signs of interference, particularly the cabinet where the communion sherry is kept. I imagine a glass may have gone missing for longer than we thought." Graves nodded grimly. "And the document? Check for inconsistencies. The deed, yes, but also the Reverend's correspondence with Jefferson. A man covering his tracks often forgets how much he's written in his own hand." By the following afternoon, Graves had results. There had indeed been fingerprints on the communion cabinet, none of them Jefferson's. One of the glasses from the church set had been cleaned and reshelved imperfectly, and bore traces of foxglove residue despite being rinsed. Further, a draft letter from Jefferson to Clara Ridgway had been discovered in the solicitor's office, referencing unexpected pressure from ecclesiastical interests to delay the land correction. He had refused. Confronted with the findings, Reverend Partridge broke, not dramatically but slowly like a statue weathered by rain. He confessed, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he had protected what was sacred, believing the end justified the means, that he had feared the scandal of losing parish land more than he feared complicity in a death. He was not charged with murder but with obstruction, falsification of records, and perversion of justice. Lavinia Toller, when informed of the development, sat silently for a long time in the magistrate's chamber. Then she turned to the inspector and asked quietly if the foxglove border in her garden had been cleared. When Graves nodded, she only said, "Good." Clara Ridgway remained in custody. Though she had not poisoned Jefferson herself, her intention to see Lavinia blamed made her culpable in the eyes of the law. The courts would sort through the details. The village, as always, had already moved on. On Miss Marple's final day in Little Wickford, she and Daphne took tea in the garden beneath the climbing roses, which had just begun to bloom. The air was warm and quiet, and the scandal, now faded to a murmur, seemed as far away as the city. "So," Daphne said as she poured, "you knew it wasn't really Lavinia all along." "You suspected," Miss Marple said, "because she was too tidy to leave her name in dust. That's the trouble with clever plans, you see. They often forget that human nature rarely cooperates." Daphne tilted her head. "But you never said, not until the very end." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People reveal themselves, dear. All one must do is allow them the silence in which to do so." And as she tucked her knitting into her satchel and gathered her things for the train, she glanced once more down the quiet lane, past the hedges and gardens and secrets folded neatly away behind curtained windows. In the dust, the truce had spelled a name, but only Jane Marple had thought to ask who had brushed it there. The gentle rumble of the afternoon train departing Little Wickford station might have signaled the end of Miss Marple's stay for many, but while her suitcase had indeed been packed and her goodbyes offered with quiet finality, she had not boarded. Instead, she had lingered just beyond the hedge at Daphne's garden, watching the soft drift of petals fall from the wild rose bushes, her eyes sharp beneath the softness of her expression. Though the matter of Jefferson's death had on the surface been tidied and tucked into a narrative suitable for village digestion, one woman blamed, another exposed, and the vicar quietly removed to diocesan care pending ecclesiastical inquiry, Miss Marple could not shake the sense that something still lingered just beyond clarity. It was not a question of motive or method, but of atmosphere, of tone. The scene refused to settle in her mind like a painting with a corner blur. Later that evening, while the rest of the village settled into its habitual rhythm of post-dinner digestives and soft murmured conversations over the wireless, Miss Marple sat alone in the small drawing room, reviewing a stack of newspaper clippings that Daphne had obligingly fetched from the local archives. They were small, mostly mundane announcements of the Conservancy garden show from previous years, letters to the editor about footpath closures, but one, clipped from the Market Ledbury Courier, nearly 6 months prior, stood out with sudden, alarming relevance. It was a notice of condolence, the death of Mrs. Caroline Penrose, née Toller, of London, deceased following a brief illness, survived by her husband, no children. A name barely remembered, but not without meaning. Caroline Penrose was Lavinia Toller's sister-in-law, and Caroline had been, for a short while, the subject of a bitter, short-lived legal suit over George Toller's will. The same Caroline who had vanished from local conversation, presumed to have reconciled with her fate in London. Yet something in the phrasing of the obituary, brief illness, stirred discomfort. Coupled with an old family name, it reminded Miss Marple of something she had heard, but not considered properly at the time, that George Toller, the late husband, had suffered from a rare but manageable cardiac condition. Digitalis had been part of his regimen, the foxglove in its pure medicinal form. It all returned to her then, not as a revelation, but as a rearranging of details she already possessed. Lavinia would have had foxglove extract in the house for years. That was already known. She'd had the knowledge, the supply, the familiarity. And if Caroline Penrose had been visiting quietly, perhaps even secretly, she might have accessed it too. The next morning, Miss Marple delayed her departure once more. She visited Inspector Graves, who, though initially surprised to see her still in Little Wickford, was quick to listen when she quietly laid out her thoughts. "You were suggesting," he said slowly, that Caroline Penrose's death in London might not have been natural? Not necessarily unnatural, said Miss Marple, but perhaps convenient, and curiously timed. Graves fetched the coroner's file from Market Ledbury with little difficulty. Caroline's death had been registered as acute cardiac arrest, brought on by underlying illness. No autopsy had been performed. Her husband had declined it, citing grief and religious conviction. Miss Marple's expression barely changed. "Do we know anything about Mr. Penrose?" "Charles Penrose," said Graves, leafing through the record. "Former pharmacist. Retired. No children. Sold his shop in Fulham 2 years ago." A pause. They exchanged a glance. "A pharmacist," Miss Marple said gently. "One with access to more precise concentrations of digitales than even a gardener could extract from foxglove." They set to work, quietly but thoroughly. Inquiries were made to the London Chemist Guild. A junior clerk confirmed that Penrose had, until recently, been embroiled in a minor disciplinary inquiry for improper disposal of expired compounds. The matter had been closed without consequence, but a curious thing for a man of his profession. Most telling, however, was what came next. A letter from Caroline, held in her solicitor's estate, had been addressed to Jefferson shortly before her death. The solicitor, hesitant but cooperative, provided it after being shown Graves's authority. The letter was brittle, brief and tired, but it was clear she had suspected that her husband, once a careful, diligent man, had begun experimenting again with home compounds, as she delicately phrased it. She feared his obsession with reclaiming the Toller property through Lavinia might have gone too far. She feared, it seemed, not what he might do to Lavinia, but what he might already have done to others. The implications were sobering. Penrose had known about Jefferson's plan to correct the deed. He had known that both Clara and Lavinia stood in his way, Clara with her entitlement, Lavinia with her possession of the land. If Jefferson died and suspicion could be cast elsewhere, perhaps Charles might quietly influence the future outcome of the estate, perhaps not immediately but over time. After all, a widow without reputation or allies was an easy target. It was not Lavinia's action that had killed Jefferson. It was a man who understood how to use her fears. Graves sat in silence for a long time after reading the letter. The need to question him. He did. Charles Penrose, still in his narrow London flat above a now shuttered apothecary shop, was as composed and unreadable as a figure in a wax museum. He admitted nothing. He denied even knowing of Jefferson's visit to Little Wickford, let alone being involved in any plot. But his hands trembled when he reached for his teacup, and he flinched, only slightly, at the mention of Caroline's final letter. It was enough for a formal inquest to be reopened into her death. The court would decide how far it reached, but the implication was there. Charles Penrose had prepared the compound, perhaps weeks earlier, and given it to Clara Ridgway under the pretense of helping her frighten Lavinia into surrendering the land voluntarily. What Clara had not understood was that the dosage measured by a former pharmacist with bitterness in his blood had never been intended merely to cause illness. When the full truth came to light, little Wickford fell into one of those long silences the village so rarely indulged. There was no talk of it at the bakery, nor whispered speculation outside the post office. Instead, there was a sort of collective embarrassment, as though the village itself had been implicated, used in the most intimate way as a stage for a cruel and cunning manipulation. Lavinia Toller was quietly released, her reputation bruised but not broken. Clara Ridgway, still under investigation, remained in London under supervision, and Charles Penrose disappeared into official custody, into memory, into that peculiar fog that sometimes swallows up villains not with vengeance but with silence. On her actual departure day, as the train pulled gently away from the platform, Miss Marple sat beside the window, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. Daphne, who had come to see her off, stood waving gently from the edge of the platform. As the station blurred into countryside, Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. People often believed crimes were about money, or inheritance, or rage. But in truth, the most dangerous motive of all was humiliation, the fear of being seen as weak, of being forgotten. And in the end, it was not Lavinia, nor Clara, nor even Jefferson who had carried the darkest intention. It was a man who used silence like a scalpel and let others bleed for his benefit. The countryside rolled by in shades of green and gold, and Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The pattern at last was complete, though the countryside outside the train window unfolded in a gentle, unbroken quilt of meadows and hedgerows. Miss Marple's thoughts refused such order. Her hands moved rhythmically, needles flashing in soft clinks of metal, but the click of the train's wheels over the tracks echoed louder in her ears than the pattern she knitted. Behind her, little Wickford faded into memory, its spires and secrets tucked away like the end of a sentence. And yet, despite all that had come to light, something in the affair remained imperfectly aligned. It was not the facts. They had been laid out with painful precision. Jefferson had been poisoned. The glass had been tampered with. Clara Ridgway had seen an opportunity and seized it with a kind of cool ruthlessness. Charles Penrose, the quiet, calculating pharmacist widower, had provided the means. It was a plot that bore all the elements of cunning and callousness, and yet Miss Marple frowned faintly as she adjusted a stitch. It was too complete. She had seen it before, cases that resolved too neatly, in which each culprit confessed or was exposed in due turn, and the village tucked away its scandal with a sigh of weary relief. But human behavior did not follow neat patterns. It frayed at the edges. It resisted closure. By the time she changed trains at Chipping Hollows, the thought had taken firmer root. It was something she had overlooked, a detail she had accepted without resistance because it fit, and the moment she realized what it was, she let out a very small sound, barely more than a breath, and closed her knitting bag with deliberate care. 2 days later, back in Stanmary Mead, she received a visitor, a young man with freckles and an expression of wary gratitude. He introduced himself as Harold Danvers, a solicitor's clerk from Market Ledbury, sent on behalf of Inspector Graves. "Who said you might like to see this, Miss Marple?" he said, offering her a brown folder stamped, "Supplementary Statement, Toller Estate. It's not official, just something he thought you might want to examine." She offered him tea and a currant bun, which he declined politely, and once he'd gone, she opened the file and read it thoroughly, twice. It contained a revised inventory of George Toller's will, a ledger of the disputed land parcels, and most curiously, a photocopy of the envelope Caroline Penrose had addressed to Felix Jefferson. It had arrived at the solicitor's office 3 days after her death. Miss Marple stared at the envelope for a very long time. The handwriting was neat, restrained, with the rounded capitals of someone used to schoolroom script. But it wasn't Caroline's. She'd seen Caroline's writing years ago, in a thank you note to the village auxiliary committee. It was broader, more angular. The envelope had been written by someone else. The letter itself was from Caroline. That much had been established, but the envelope, someone had handled it, repackaged it, sent it on in her name after her death. Someone with a vested interest in ensuring that the letter reached Jefferson, perhaps not to warn him, but to make it seem as if he had been warned. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She read the statement again, focusing now not on the content, but the omissions. The wording around the solicitor's involvement, the phrasing of "received in trust" and "forwarded posthumously." The solicitor had not known Caroline personally. The letter had been delivered to him by a man described as an associate of Mr. Penrose. But there had been no such associate recorded in Penrose's professional history. She rose from her chair with slow purpose and retrieved a small red notebook from her bureau, one of several she kept, filled with clipped articles, names, events, odd turns of phrase and memory. And there it was. Not a name but a face. Hester Kane, the maid. Quiet. Dead. Present in nearly every room of Lavinia Toller's home during the days leading up to Jefferson's death. Loyal to her mistress, yes, but unusually informed. Miss Marple recalled Hester's comment the day of the murder. She keeps muttering about how dust doesn't lie. That phrase had seemed dramatic at the time, even poetic. But how had she known what was written in the dust? No one had said aloud then what the word was. And yet Hester had known. Miss Marple picked up the telephone and placed a call to Inspector Graves. When his familiar voice answered, she said, without preamble, "Inspector, I believe we may have overlooked one final hand in this affair. Would you be so good as to look into the employment history of Miss Hester Kane? I believe she may not be quite who she claims." There was a pause. Then Graves said, "I thought it was over." "So did I," she replied. "But someone made sure the last piece fit too cleanly. And as you know, in matters of murder, tidiness is often the surest sign of misdirection." The investigation that followed was swift but quiet. Hester Kane, it turned out, had no family records before the age of 16. Her references for service had been supplied by a private firm, now defunct. A few contacts had vague memories of a clever girl, but nothing concrete. It was Graves who uncovered the link. A newspaper clipping, nearly 10 years old, from the Bristol Recorder. A trial. A woman named Eleanor Kane, dismissed from a small private clinic after being discovered forging prescriptions and diluting medication. The woman had vanished before formal charges could be brought. She would be nearly 30 now. The right age. The same dark hair. A new name. A new life. As Hester. The quiet, invisible maid. It wasn't hard then to reassemble her motive. Miss Marple had seen her type before. Devoted, resentful, clever, but ignored. Lavinia had been her employer, perhaps even her benefactor, and yet she had stood to lose everything if Lavinia's reputation were ruined. More than loyalty, it was self-preservation. Hester had known about the foxglove, about the poisoned glass. She had seen Lavinia prepare it, perhaps even helped her do so, thinking it harmless. But when Jefferson died, Hester had acted. She ensured that suspicion would fall on Clara Ridgway first. She told Miss Marple about the missing glass, and she had likely retrieved the letter from Caroline's effects, addressed the envelope herself, and delivered it in Caroline's name to frame Charles Penrose with elegant precision. She had used truth like a scalpel, just as he had. Graves arrested her without incident. She did not deny it. In fact, she said very little, only that she had been correcting what needed correcting. That Lavinia was too gentle to survive what they wanted to do to her. She had taken it upon herself to protect her mistress first from public disgrace, then from ruin, and finally from the law. Miss Marple received a letter from Graves 3 days later. It was short and to the point. "You were right again. The real story was underneath the one we thought we understood. You've a gift for seeing the thread that pulls it all loose." She folded the letter and placed it in the back of her notebook.